quick message before we start. We hope our conversations open up new perspectives and new ideas for our listeners, and our goal is to be informative. But we want to emphasize that this isn't a substitute for individual therapy, and we're not providing medical or psychological advice here. If you feel moved by what you hear, and if you want to explore it more deeply, or if there's something in your life you'd like to work on, please reach out to an LGBTQ affirming therapist online or in your area. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome to the Psych Out Podcast, where two psychology nerds get psyched up for LGBTQ affirming history, research, and practice. And now your hosts, Chris and Jen.
Welcome, everybody, to the Psych Out Podcast. I'm Chris, and with me is my friend and co-host.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jen. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice, and I work largely with LGBTQ plus clients. And Chris, tell us about you.
I'm a master's student studying clinical psychology and specializing in LGBTQ affirmative psychology.
So we're going to talk about right now a familiar name, one of our rogues gallery of psychologists, psychiatrists who've done great damage to the trans community, LGBTQ community in general. One, Paul McHugh, who, if you listen to one of our earlier episodes about this, is the person who got the transgender gender affirming care clinic shut down in Johns Hopkins in the 1970s. And one of the ways that he managed to accomplish this was through bad science. And today we're going to talk a lot about some particular instances of bad science that have come upon our radar, and really the radar of the gender affirming care sort of field ever so recently. So what happened in 1979 was a researcher named John Mayer. And interestingly, in the article that I found, they also wanted to talk about his assistant, whose last name was R-E-T-E-R, Rader, who is a woman. And I want to include her because even if they do bad science, I want to make sure that the women assistants also get credit.
That's true.
So Mayer and Reader, 1979.
We don't need to contribute to that ongoing erasure of the women assistants who were doing most of the work. Yeah.
Of women.
Assistants.
Right, exactly. And I love no one could hear the air quotes, but yes, air quotes, assistants. So two people who I don't necessarily respect, but want to give them the respect of saying they did their work anyway, came out with a report that was supposed to show that gender affirming care was not successful. And the outcome measure that they used to show that it wasn't successful was that people did not increase their employment or their experience in long-term, in parentheses, heterosexual relationships subsequent to receiving gender affirming care. So gender affirming care did not give people more jobs or make them more straight. We're just going to pause a beat for that. And when I read that, this was like the article that Paul McHugh was kind of most able to say, like, look at this, our work isn't working, like our gender affirming care isn't succeeding the way that it should. So let's just not do it anymore. Right. Totally oversimplifying the case. But like, if we think of that as like the tipping point, right? I go all the way back to the very first thing we talked about in this podcast, which is, Chris, when you and I were researching post-traumatic stress disorder, and the way that entire concept, the entire diagnosis was conceived around getting soldiers back onto the battlefield.
Yeah. Getting people back to work, back to the front lines.
Right. And the concept of psychology and psychiatry being not about leading to a happier life, leading to self-actualization, but being about eliminating obstacles to be productive in a certain model of society lies at the tension of so much of what we're going to talk about today.
And what we've already talked about.
Yes, definitely. Do you want to talk about the specific thing that got us thinking about this particular moment in history today?
Yes, I do.
I mean, do we want to?
Want is a strong word.
But do we feel compelled to now? Yes.
But we thought that we should do a quick take podcast responding to a work that's come out of Robert Kennedy Jr.'s Department of Health and Human Services.
Yes.
The Trump administration issued an executive order some months back commissioning this report. And 4 months later, we have a 407-page document. This is the Treatment for Pediatric Gender Dysphoria Review of Evidence and Best Practices. And unlike most reports we see, it does not list any authors.
No.
Jen.
Yeah, let me talk about that a little bit. I think it's interesting, and also it's so the claim that is being made is that the reason why authors aren't listed is that this is something called a preprint. And a preprint is when a researcher publishes in some way the results of their research before it goes through peer review. And the peer review process is when you get other experts in a field to look at a study before it's being published in order to make sure that it follows like a high standard of research design, that it's ethical in the way that it goes about doing things, that it explains things in a way that has integrity to what the research results are, et cetera, et cetera. So that's peer review, right? So people sometimes will pre-print what they wrote because they want that information out there. Like peer review can take a long time, so they want the information out there. So this makes a lot of sense. Let's say you're doing research on a particular treatment for a particular illness, and you find favorable results on this way of doing the treatment and not that way of doing the treatment. You want to pre-print that if there are other people doing that research, so you can give them information to maybe direct the choices that they're making and how they're using the grant money that they have and the time and resources they have, right? So it's very useful sometimes to do a preprint in a certain like scientific community where everybody like is kind of working off of each other's data and knows what they're friggin' doing. What you don't want to use a preprint for is for actually like trying to direct the course of treatment, because you need peer review before you can make recommendations like that. So the second part of this, though, is that it's anonymous. And the reason why they say it's anonymous is because as a preprint, it hasn't been through peer review yet. And if the people doing the peer review were to know who wrote the document, it might bias the peer review process.
Yeah. You mentioned you don't want to do this sort of preprint thing for something that's aimed at directing the course of treatment. And this document, it goes out of its way to say that it is not trying to give clinical recommendations, but it also spends far more time attacking and criticizing the existing much larger body of work that directs clinical recommendations for how to give this treatment. And it feels like it's trying to create a power vacuum, say, don't use this established medical consensus document, but we have no further recommendations for you at this time.
Yeah. Although best practices is right there in the title. So
yes.
You know that this it's not being upfront about what its goal is. And that's even more than the anonymity. Because like I said, I don't think that the reasoning behind the anonymity really holds water. I think that you shouldn't have a preprint and anonymity at the same time. That's a terrible idea anyway. But like the thing that I think is more important than the anonymity is the lack of being upfront about what the goal of the document is.
Yeah.
And to understand the goal, because they don't seem to be like representing it very clearly, we kind of want to talk a little bit about the larger context of how this document came to be. Chris, do you want to like give a little bit more of the context here?
As I alluded to up top, this report was commissioned through a executive order of the Trump administration. And I think it's important to view this in that context. The Trans Journalists Association put out a press release on this, giving advice for journalists on how to contextualize discussions about this. And what we're doing here is not journalism. It's, podcast is an odd space. I think we're much closer to an opinion side of things. But I think it's very important to provide that context, and just for starters, the name of that executive order that commissioned the report was Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation.
Right.
This is prejudicial language.
Yeah, the outcome was explicitly preordained by the order requesting the study to begin with, like in black and white.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. And I'll read directly from what Trans Journalists Association put out here. of all of the executive orders issued this year, at least 1 out of every 10 has sought to change regulations around gender. And this is part of an increasingly explicit effort to redefine transgender people out of legal existence and exclude them from public life. So this document is existing in a context that is explicitly political, is explicitly trying to change health outcomes for the worse and reduce access to care.
Yeah. And it really, the document itself is written in a way that maybe is trying to conceal that, but the context surrounding the document is making absolutely no bones about it. It's very clear that that's what it's intending to do.
Exactly. If you read some legislative record of some state a year from now where people are trying to restrict access to care, they're going to be citing documents like this. And if you're trying to get a handle on what you think about this issue as a layperson, you might pick this report up and it might look impartial. The context in which it's being released shows the lie of that, I feel.
I also want to, because it spends a lot of time trying to attack and deconstruct this, like really talk about the mirror of this article, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health's standards of care. And we're on the standards of care 8, and it's a very substantive, systematic review of literature that is created, like they've been doing this work since the late 1970s, and this particular version took 10 years to create, not a few months to create. And if you look at it, if you were to compare the two, you'd see in the WPATH version, every substantive statement related to care has half a dozen citations at least out of it. Like, and it's hyperlinked. So you can just look over the document and see how much of the blue hyperlinking is in there showing studies that are supporting the statement that's being made in the document. It's very good at also looking at the breadth of studies and anything that maybe doesn't fully fit into the recommendations that they're making and discussing it. It is a very scientific document.
Mm-hmm.
This is not. In many, many ways. And it is written in the sort of language and style of a systematic review, and it claims to be using tools of a systematic review, but it does not meet that standard. You were going to say, Chris?
I was going to say, one of the things that stands out to me in my own, reading through of the WPATH 8 standards of care, I have not read the entire document, but I've worked with it in school, is it, in common with most scientific papers I read, is upfront about the uncertainties that it has.
Yes.
But also, views those uncertainties through the scientific lens of, this is what we have to learn. These uncertainties don't invalidate what we already know. They aren't a reason to stop trying to use this science in the real world to help people in, professions like this,
right,
or whatever you're using your science for.
Right.
This document that we're responding to by Department of Health and Human Services is deeply uncomfortable with any sort of uncertainty, but the context it's happening in is a context in which the administration is massively defunding the kind of
any attempt to get any more certainty.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And can I revise what you said just really quick? I don't think it's deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. I think it loves to exploit uncertainty.
I love that reframing. Say more about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things we talked about in our episode about bad science was that good science is fundamentally humble. Good science is willing to say, we don't know everything, and we're never going to know everything. We're going to tiptoe our way toward more and more knowledge. And in the meantime, we're going to make the best decisions based on the information we have to take care of the people around us.
Yes.
What this report does is go, oh, you don't know everything, do you? Well, if there's any uncertainty, then we need to err on the side of not helping people in ways that we don't like.
Yeah.
It uses it as a way of getting in there and saying, well, do we see people getting lots of jobs? No. Do we see parents being happy with their children's names? No. Oh, well, it's not making people that we care about happy, even if it's making our patients happy. Therefore, we're going to exploit those uncertainties in order to stop making care available to our patients.
Yeah. It projects a lot of uncertainty because it hopes that readers will come away from it deeply uncertain.
Right, exactly. And what I would say, if you want to compare these two documents using like just that very basic idea of what is the essence of science, which one is humble? Which one comes across as humble? Because that's probably the one that's doing good science.
Yeah.
Right. I do also, I'm backing up just a quick minute to speaking of uncertainty, the anonymity of the authors. One of the manipulative things about doing like a preprint, like anonymous article in this way, of course, is that when the authors finally do get revealed, they will have already gone through the news cycle. Like there's versus a scientific paper where the only people who are going to notice it are going to be the scientists in that field or the researchers in this field. This is like it gets into the news cycle. And when we find out who actually wrote it, it will be long gone from anybody's consciousness.
Yeah.
Not least of which, like, in addition to if there is any peer review process that actually happens and whatever the outcome of that is. And interestingly, so like I want to define what a systematic review of literature is, right? So the systematic in systematic review of literature is really important. So it's not just like a lit review. It's not just like I went and I found a bunch of articles and now I'm going to summarize the articles, right? Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be going through and broadly sampling research results and then doing a system or a process to decide which ones are biased or reliable or high quality studies. And this HHS report cites a couple of tools that are often used to do that, like the grade process that I don't know how to pronounce, ROBIS, ROBIS process. I don't do systematic reviews. So you ask me, yeah, exactly. I've seen it written. All of which involve groups of people coming together and rating articles based on certain criteria.
I've never heard it said out loud.
Who are those groups of people? We don't know because this is a fully anonymous report. Mm-hmm. So how systematic is this? I suspect not very.
And didn't it also say that it was like 2 people?
Well, the standards for doing this kind of like the grade and ROBIS, however you say it, review is more than 2 people.
Yeah.
So I don't know if what they mean is that there were only 2 authors and then there were multiple people involved in that particular moment in it, right? Like I don't know if people would name them.
Right. And it's not clear because of how little information the document has.
Right. But here's like, it's so funny. There's so much of this episode that's just going to be flashbacks to previous episodes of ours. Here's why I don't think that they went through that process. They, for instance, cite articles where the methodology and the reporting was so bad that they got temporarily retracted and forced to publish amendments or further explanations, further information, which, if you recall, the study, the Littman study about rapid onset gender dysphoria, which had to be like, she had to go in and like give a complete like reaccounting of how she gathered her data, is cited unproblematically in this study. If you were doing a systematic review of the literature and you were rating the reliability, you know, the level of bias of a study, you would not be including a study where you're talking about the etiology of gender dysphoria by only talking to parents who are angry that their kids have gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
The document sort of tries to have it both ways, where it says, oh, it's doing a, systematic review of systematic reviews. And, maybe it doesn't consider that particular Littman paper like a systematic review. It's not. It's not presenting itself as that.
Yeah.
But they still cite that and other Littman works that are also not systematic reviews, like throughout the rest of the document. It's really trying to say we're one thing, but it has really the quality of a kitchen sink sort of report. It's like any sort of evidence that they might want to get into a record so that it can be easily bound up and used to sponsor more legislation to take more existing rights away from trans people.
Yeah.
That's what this is doing.
At LGBTQ Evolutions, we know that change starts with people like you. Every act of kindness, every dollar, and every moment of your time brings us closer to removing the barriers that prevent our friends and family from being themselves. Together, we can create a brighter, more compassionate future for our community. Donate today with the link below.
Another researcher who shows up a lot, who we haven't talked about in previous episodes, but would be worth putting in our rogues gallery, is Kenneth Zucker, who is a Canadian, I think he's a psychiatrist, who helped run until like very recently, until like 10 years ago, a gender affirming care program out of one of the major medical centers in Toronto. And that was the medical center, after a lot of challenges to the quality of that care, suggesting that the care was essentially like conversion therapy, did their own like independent, like hired independent reviewers. And the program was shut down because they were not following the standards of care current in the field for gender affirming care, because they were still based on this very like old model, right? So they're also leaning a lot on Kenneth Zucker's work, even though Kenneth Zucker's work has also been like pretty broadly discredited in some pretty extreme ways in the field. So you get the idea, like their idea of what a systematic review is and their choice about like what authors to be unproblematically including in their analysis. It's pretty sus. I don't know. Is that a dumb way of putting it?
It's very sus.
It's not very. Yeah, it makes me reading it with even just the amount of knowledge that I have in the field go, well, I can't. This is like if I read. Here's my parallel. If I read an undergrad paper and that undergraduate had to write like a 20-page paper, big paper for them, and they started it the night before. And they only could get so many things. They could only find so many articles based on the search terms that they had. And then they had like a thing that they wanted to say in their paper. And they were just like, you know what, I'm going to take this article from 1979 and I'm going to take this like thing that is really just an opinion piece. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to take this study, but I don't have time to pay any attention to whether the study is any good. And then I'm going to weave together some kind of argument from it because I already turned in my thesis to my hypothesis to my teaching assistant. So I have to say the thing in my hypothesis. So let me wedge the thing. That's how this reads.
Yeah.
And I think to the untrained eye, it doesn't read that way because it's good at the lingo.
Yeah.
Right. Like it does have the tone of the genre of like a systematic review pretty well down. But if you look at what it's doing, it's like the undergrad who already turned in their hypothesis, who has to write this paper. It's 20 pages long and they started it the night before and only have really bad resources.
Yeah. I have a fun sidebar to that. There is a occasional punchiness to this document that I recognize when I am writing my last minute papers and I feel like, ooh, I've got a really good point I can make here. There's a moment where it claims that WPATH retracted a statement. And in order to show that the statement was retracted, they cite a 404 page. They cite a website that says this document's no longer available. But if you are not in as much of a hurry as those authors were, and you search the WPATH website a little more closely, you'll see that it's still up there with a different link that they weren't able to find because they didn't care to find it, because they said, ooh, wouldn't it be fun if I had a footnote that was just like a file not found, an error message? Like that would be so punchy.
Right. Which is interesting because they don't talk about Littman having to do essentially a retraction of her paper.
Right.
I also want to talk about, because this was remember in our science episode, our first half was bad studies and our second half was misrepresentations of studies. And that's another thing that they do throughout. And the American Academy of Pediatrics even came out with a statement, and I'm going to read their statement. This report misrepresents the current medical consensus and fails to reflect the realities of pediatric care. As we have seen with immunizations, not surprising that there's a parallel there, right? Bypassing medical expertise and scientific evidence has real consequences for the health of America's children. AAP was not consulted in the development of this report, yet our policy and intentions behind our recommendations were cited throughout in inaccurate and misleading ways. The report prioritizes opinions over dispassionate reviews of evidence. And another throwback to that science episode, remember we talked about I'm going to have to say this name one more, Dejna study. We called it the Swedish study because I don't know if I'm saying Dejna right. That one also shows up with the exact same misinterpretation that we talk about in that science episode. So there's also a lot of like misrepresenting what particular research, like where researchers have even come out multiple times and said, this is a misrepresentation of the findings of my study.
Yeah. And I'll just say, I think that really speaks to why we wanted to do this, as sort of an emergency pod and respond to a document that, very few people have read in full. We're engaging with it. We haven't read the whole document, but as we started to engage with it, we immediately started to see these studies that we've done podcasts on, that we've researched on our own and written papers about. Like, it didn't take us very much time as people with experience in this subject to see red flags like all over the place. And that's why we felt we wanted to speak up quickly and do this podcast.
I want to go back to that 1979 study.
Yeah.
I want to transition a little bit. Like I think we've talked also before about like sometimes it's a good release to be able to look at like really bad science and be able to pick it apart. And I think we've done a lot of that. Hopefully we've given you tools for what to say if somebody brings up this report to you. There are other breakdowns that will link. So far there have been like a couple of really good like preliminary breakdowns of this study. I hate report, whatever, air quote report.
I've been saying
polemic,
document.
This document.
Polemic?
But we'll link the preliminary ones that have showed up. I'm sure someone will put out like a much more like detailed and substantive one, so that if you are hearing somebody, like people will definitely be bringing this to like school board meetings and legislative things and people who do not understand how any of this works. So hopefully we've given you a little bit of a tool to be able to speak up if that is being cited.
Yeah.
But I want to go to that sort of deeper idea of what are we even doing here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another little note, and we want us to talk about this someday, but there's a report that was used in the UK called the Cass report that was produced by a non-expert in the field who at least put her name to that report and also had many of the same sort of structural and like integrity problems that this report has, that they crib off of quite a bit. And one of the things that the Cass report talks about is this idea that puberty delaying medications or puberty blockers are somehow obviously a failure because many of the kids who go on puberty blockers end up going on cross-sex hormones, as if it is a failure for trans people to exist.
Yeah.
And I think that underlying all of this is the idea that it is a failure for trans people to exist because trans people do not fit into a certain conservative model of how people should exist in the world. And I want to read a quote on this study, and this is from a Scientific American article that we can link as well. In their study, Mayer and Reeder, got to include the assistant here, contacted previous patients of the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic to understand whether surgery had improved patients' lives. The authors developed an adjustment scoring system. They assigned points to patients who were in heterosexual marriages and had achieved economic security since their operations, while deducting points from those who continued to engage in gender nonconformity, whatever that means, homosexuality, criminality, or sought mental health care. They concluded sex reassignment surgery confers no objective advantage in terms of social rehabilitation, but it is subjectively satisfying to the patients themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There is not a movement, a broad movement of people receiving gender affirming care who are saying we're not happy with it.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that too in a later episode, because of course there is regret that happens among some people. And of course, we know there are some people who choose to reverse the choices that they've made, whether socially or physically in their transition. I'm not trying to say that that's not happening. But statistically speaking, there is not a broad movement of people saying, this didn't help me.
Yeah.
There is a broad movement of people saying, we don't want them to exist.
Yeah.
Because they don't fit into our model of a capitalist, heterosexual, Christian nationalists, in my opinion, probably white nationalist society. And if we do not read this document with that understanding in the back of our minds, we will be manipulated by this document.
Quite so.
Yeah. Anything you want to add to this? This is like, sorry. I like being more positive than this, but this is our goal here is to tear something down that deserves to be torn down. Any other thoughts that you have to add?
No, I think we've talked as we were organizing our thoughts that this, inspired some ideas for what we want to talk about soon in future episodes.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just touch on, as I read this document, some of the uncertainties that it raises, that it has firm opinions on, are fascinating to me. It is engaging in a little bit of what we're alluding to here about what is the purpose of psychotherapy, like what would it mean to have a more liberatory idea of how trans people can seek treatment within the medical system and within the psychotherapy system. It simply reaches very different and very sure opinions based on the limited facts that we have. And I think when we say good science is humble, we're trying to ground ourselves in that tradition as well. And I think a lot of the questions it raises are interesting. And I simply think it's irresponsible and untrustworthy to take these questions that we all grapple with as professionals and say, and to reach a firm conclusion about.
Right.
And this document is a firm conclusion.
Right.
It was a firm conclusion when the administrative order framed a gender affirming care as mutilation.
Right.
That is an opinion. That is a firm, hateful opinion.
Yeah. As a side note, it actually does a lot of trying to call out particular professionals in the field for what it calls biased language, which is really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there are. Here's. I don't think it's trying to grapple with those issues.
Good point. Good point.
I think it's trying to exploit that there are questions that we have, deep questions, philosophical questions, and emotional questions about trans experience, about psychology as a field, about gender in general. And those are interesting questions and questions that we delve into a lot here. And the fact that there are questions is what is making it say, oh, we have an opportunity to try to flatten out any complexity in life and make everybody the same.
Yeah.
Right? And why does it want to make everybody the same? Because people are a lot more controllable when they are not liberated.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think I called it, and then you called me out for like being kind of Jungian, right? Like the shadow to our own questions. Our questions about what is psychology even doing, about how do we define gender dysphoria, and what does it mean to respond to gender dysphoria from a medical or a political perspective. It's taking those things and it's using them to take away from people who are saying, this is what we need to be healthy and happy in our lives. We are taking these same questions and saying, how can we use these questions to deepen and enrich our practice and the lives of the people who we serve and our own lives?
Yeah.
But yeah, I find it fascinating too. And I do want to return at some future date to some of the questions, especially about how we understand gender dysphoria and the development of this diagnosis over time. I want to come back to that. But generally speaking, yeah, this is the shadow. So when people are invoking it, hopefully we've given you some tools to look to the light. That's as inspiring as I can get with this. That's my best spin, everybody. Okay, well, we have a lot of good stuff coming down the pipeline. We have some stuff that we're going to be putting up soon about like the tyranny of regret, the way that we think about people who may go through treatment and not be happy with it at the end, which is a great way of responding also to a lot of the things that are brought up in this document. And also we're going to start having a series on bisexual experience that I'm really, really excited about. We've talked a lot about gender identity. We're not going to stop talking a lot about gender identity. It's really important to talk about in general and especially right now. But when we say psych out, we mean out in a number of different ways. So we're going to talk about bisexuality quite a bit coming down the pipeline too.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that this has been helpful. And I hope that you feel equipped to be able to defend good science in the face of all-out assault on it.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you later. Bye.
You've been listening to the Psych Out Podcast. For more information on today's subject, information about our charity, or to find our Patreon, check the links below. Join us next time to learn more about the psychology of who we are.
These are difficult times. We know that some of you out there are suffering so much that you might be thinking of ending your life. If you're having thoughts of suicide, please reach out to professionals for help. You can go to an emergency room, call 911, or reach out to the hotlines we have linked in this description below. I know that many of us have had bad experiences in medical settings, but there are people, many people in this field who want you to live. Please reach out for help so that you can find them. We want you around for our next talk.